Decisions can seem powerful in the moment, but what happens when they come back to haunt you in ways you never saw coming? The feeling of control can be intoxicating, but it often hides consequences that creep up when you least expect them. This is the story of how arrogance, in the blink of an eye, can transform into regret. Let's begin in the heart of a high-rise office building, a tower that symbolized success for both the company and its employees. People from all over the city would look up at the gleaming windows, seeing the wealth and prestige contained within. It was the kind of place that drew ambitious individuals, and it was here that Sarah Williams had spent 5 years of her life, working tirelessly for the company, Montgomery and Company. Sarah wasn't just any employee. She had poured her soul into the job, consistently outperforming her colleagues and delivering results that exceeded expectations. The long hours, missed weekends, and sacrifice were worth it, or so she believed. The pride she felt in her work, however, never seemed to reach the ears of the company's founder, the ever-arrogant James Montgomery. James was the epitome of privilege. He had inherited his position, surrounded by a team of trusted yes-men who flattered him at every turn. He didn't pay much attention to the inner workings of the company anymore. He left that to others. What he did focus on was making sure the spotlight stayed firmly on him. People like Sarah, who quietly excelled in their work, went unnoticed in the shadows. In James's eyes, she was a tool to be used, a cog in his machine, not a valuable part of the company. It was late on a Thursday afternoon when Sarah was called into James's office for a meeting. No warning, no agenda, just an abrupt summons. As she entered the pristine space, Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had done nothing wrong, but a strange, unsettling feeling crept over her. James was reclining in his chair, wearing his usual smug grin, looking at her with the kind of superiority that always made her skin crawl. "Sarah," he began, leaning back as though this were a casual chat. "We've decided to go in a new direction. We're letting you go." Sarah blinked, her heart skipping a beat. The words hung in the air, suffocating. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice steady despite the shock threatening to break through. James exhaled, shifting in his chair. "It's a business decision. You just don't fit the company's future goals anymore. We're moving in a new direction." Her chest tightened. She was well aware of the corporate jargon he was using, but this felt different. Sarah had been with the company for 5 years. Her performance reviews had always been exemplary, and her colleagues respected her. So why now? Why her? There had to be something more. "Is there a reason for this?" Sarah asked, her voice calm even though the fire inside her was beginning to stir. "I've met every target. I've been a top performer every year. According to company policy, there should be cause for termination." James merely smiled, the kind of smile that said he held all the cards. "It's just a business decision. Let's not complicate things." Sarah's heart raced, but she forced herself to breathe steadily. She had seen the signs, the passive-aggressive comments, the way her ideas were always overshadowed by her more likable colleagues, and the subtle exclusion from important projects. The company had always had its biases, but now it seemed her time had come. "I understand," she said softly, though her mind was already racing. She didn't need to argue or plead. There was nothing left to say. She stood up, her back straight, and headed toward the door. "I'll pack my things." As Sarah walked out of his office, her pride was intact, but there was a cold, simmering anger inside her. She had seen how James treated others who weren't in his inner circle. His behavior had been toxic, discriminatory even, and now it was her turn to face the consequences of his arrogance. Her colleague, Mark, was sitting at his desk when she passed. He didn't look up, but Sarah could hear his voice tremble as he whispered, "I'm so sorry, Sarah." She didn't stop to explain or seek comfort. She had a plan now, and she would execute it not out of anger, but out of a quiet resolve for justice. Mark's words stuck with her, though. "I'm so sorry." It wasn't just sympathy. He knew exactly what had been going on in the company. The toxic atmosphere, the backstabbing, the favoritism. He had seen it all, and now Sarah was a casualty of it. The injustice stung, but Sarah knew that it wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. As Sarah packed up her desk, she felt the weight of years of hard work folding into cardboard boxes. The office, once a place of pride and purpose, now felt hollow, the walls closing in on her. She took one last look around the room, at the photos on her desk, the certificates on the wall, the email threads that told the story of her dedication. It was all about to become a memory. The whispers from the nearby cubicles were almost deafening. Sarah had always been aware of the subtle dynamics within the office, those who towed the line and those who, like her, worked hard, often without recognition. It wasn't just James's blatant favoritism. It was the way his power influenced everyone around him. The same people who were friendly to her in private now averted their gaze as she walked by. They were relieved it wasn't them, she knew. But Sarah wasn't concerned with them anymore. She glanced over at Mark, who was still sitting at his desk, staring at his screen with a furrowed brow. He was trying to ignore the fact that she was leaving, pretending it was just another day. Sarah sighed, not surprised by the lack of support from most of her colleagues. A few nodded in sympathy, but most remained silent. This was how things worked in Montgomery and Company. If you weren't part of the in crowd, you were expendable. Mark approached her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Sarah, I don't get it. You've been nothing but exceptional here. They can't just do this." Sarah gave him a tight smile. "It's just business, Mark. That's all they see it as. Just business." "But it's not. This is personal," Mark insisted, lowering his voice. "James has always played favorites. It's just wrong." She nodded, agreeing with him silently. She had seen it before. James's treatment of women, his subtle racism, and how he used his power to control others. It wasn't a matter of performance. It was about who you knew, how well you played the game. She'd been on the wrong side of it all along. "I'll be fine," she said, pushing the last of her things into a box. "It's just not the right fit anymore." As she stood to leave, the door to James's office was open just enough for her to see him lounging in his chair, a smug grin on his face as he scrolled through his phone. She could have walked in and confronted him, but she didn't. Not yet. The last thing she needed was to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much this had hurt her. Her fight was just beginning, but it would be on her terms. Sarah left the office, her head held high, but beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. She didn't feel defeated. No, far from it. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the final push that would propel her into a different kind of battle. As she stepped out into the street, her thoughts raced. She had been wronged, but now it was time to make that wrong right. Back at home, Sarah wasted no time. She sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and began typing furiously. The email draft in front of her was simple but powerful. It outlined the toxic work culture at Montgomery and Company, the blatant favoritism, the subtle biases James Montgomery had displayed, and how, despite all her contributions, she had been pushed aside in favor of those who played the game. Her fingers hovered over the send button. But this wasn't just an internal email. No, this was a public statement, one that would reveal the underbelly of Montgomery and Company to the world. She could feel the weight of the decision in the pit of her stomach. But it wasn't fear. It was a quiet, determined confidence. She knew what she had to do. She clicked send. Immediately, her inbox filled with responses, both from her former colleagues and from outside sources. Within hours, the email had gone viral, shared by industry insiders, former employees, and even some clients who had long suspected the company's practices. Sarah's name began trending on social media, and with it, the stories of others who had faced similar treatment within the company. James Montgomery, on the other hand, was oblivious. He still believed his power was untouchable. He continued his day as if nothing had happened. But Sarah knew something he didn't. The storm had started, and there was no way to stop it. As the day progressed, Sarah's phone rang. One call after another from journalists, from former employees, from people wanting to add their voices to the growing movement. She wasn't alone anymore. This was bigger than her. This was about holding people like James accountable for their actions. The fallout was already beginning. Clients started to pull back. The board was restless, and soon they'd be forced to address the public outcry. Sarah could almost hear the panic rising in Montgomery and Company. But for now, she remained calm. She had set the wheels in motion, and there was no turning back. The next few days were a blur for Sarah. What had started as a quiet act of defiance in the face of injustice had quickly turned into a full-blown corporate crisis. The email she had sent was now being shared across platforms, catching the attention of media outlets, influencers, and even those who had never worked at Montgomery and Company. It seemed that everyone had a story to share, and soon, Sarah wasn't just a victim. She had become a symbol of resistance. James Montgomery, once the untouchable CEO, was now scrambling. His office, usually a fortress of confidence, was filled with tension. He was meeting with lawyers, crisis managers, and his board, all of them trying to contain the fallout. The company's stock began to drop, and what had once been a shining example of corporate success was now under public scrutiny for its toxic environment. Sarah had ignited a fire that no amount of money or power could extinguish. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself at the center of a movement. People were reaching out to her, offering support, and sharing their own stories of discrimination, bias, and the abuse of power in their workplaces. What had started as a personal fight for justice had turned into a crusade for others who had been silenced for too long. Despite the overwhelming attention, Sarah remained focused. She knew this was just the beginning. The legal battles would come next, and her fight wasn't over. But for now, she allowed herself a quiet moment of triumph. She had exposed the truth, and in doing so, she had shown that power, real power, came from lifting others up, not from tearing them down. As the phone calls kept coming in and the media requests piled up, she paused and reflected. How did she get here? It wasn't just about getting revenge on James. It was about creating a world where people could speak up and be heard, where no one would ever again suffer in silence for fear of losing their job. Now, she had a choice to make. Whether to walk away from it all or to use her newfound platform to push for lasting change. What do you think? Was Sarah's move the right one, or should she have pursued a different course of action? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to see how the story unfolds further, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more incredible stories of empowerment and justice.